Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gadi Schwartz coming to you from Los Angeles, and we have late-breaking details on a tragedy that happened right next to the Titanic. After a brief pocket of hope, all 5 people on a small exploratory sub are believed to be dead, and there are so many questions now coming to the surface. Did the Navy hear an implosion when that sub lost contact? We're also learning more about some questionable red flags from the company behind the sub. So are lawsuits going to start piling up? Danny Savalas is here to explain, and we're going to also look into what this catastrophe could mean for the future of sea exploration. There is a whole lot to get to tonight, so we are spending the next 30 minutes to unfold exactly what we know about the Titan's final moments. And breaking tonight, a senior U.S. Navy official is telling us that the Navy may have detected what sounded like an implosion or explosion in the general area of the Titanic and the Titan, and it happened around the same time as the Titan lost communication with its team on the surface. Now, the source is saying that info was passed on to an incident commander, but that was all part of a bunch of other acoustic data that was shared, presumably including those sounds of what might have been knocking or banging that came afterwards. And so the rescue efforts continued until this morning, and a tragic discovery, a discovery of wreckage right next to the Titanic. So many questions, and the very few answers that we are starting to get are coming from another robotic sub that has been sent down 2.5 miles to the site of the Titanic, and it has come across so much debris. Right now, we know of at least 5 pieces of what looks like the wreckage of the Titan that have been found about 1,600 feet away from the bow of the Titanic. That's a little more than a quarter of a mile away. And so far, the wreckage appears to be the nose cone, which was the only place you could look out from inside the sub, the front and back end bells, and parts of that pressurized hull. All 5 passengers on board are now presumed dead. They have been identified as Stockton Rush, the CEO of Ocean Gate Expeditions, the company behind that mission, British billionaire Hamish Harding, prominent Pakistani businessman Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son Suleiman, and French dive expert Paul-Henri Nargeolet. Now, the company in charge of the expedition released a statement today that read, "These men were true explorers who shared a distinct spirit of adventure and a deep passion for exploring and protecting the world's oceans." NBC's Tom Costello has been following every single development in this story, and he joins us now. Tom, they have the location. They have a lot of equipment in place. Yeah. What happens next?
Well, the bottom line here is that the international community has got to decide how they're going to proceed. So this is no longer a search and rescue effort, and the the French are involved, the Canadians, the Americans, of course. And those 3 bodies have to come together and decide, okay, are we going to try to recover the debris from the sub, and are we going to try to recover the victims? This is now moved out of search and rescue, so this may be a decision also that is going to be based on whether the company, singular, that's involved here wants to pay for that operation. Do the governments, do the taxpayers want to pay for that operation? Is it safe to conduct that kind of an operation? You know, the Titanic itself is an ocean, a graveyard rather, at sea. 1,500 people died there, and they were not recovered. They literally were buried at sea. So I think there are a lot of questions here about who conducts the investigation and how do they go forward and who pays for it.
Tom, I'm not exactly sure how this works so deep in the ocean, but do they have a solid visual on this stuff for these sonar reads that are coming in from something else? Or, I mean, I want to ask, is there any chance that this is debris from the Titanic?
No, they know for sure it's not. And it's not sonar. They actually have, they put down this very high-end Canadian robotic vehicle. It's called an ROV, a remote vehicle, and it went down there with cameras, with lights, and it immediately saw the debris from Titan. That is the small sub. So there is no doubt they identified the pieces. They're not telling us whether they also identified the victims, but they clearly identified that this is Titan, and it was a good distance away from the Titanic. I asked one of the representatives at this press conference today, one of the oceanographers, to give us a sense of where this debris field is. Here's what he said.
It's in an area where there is not any debris of Titanic. It is a smooth bottom. There, to my knowledge and anything I've seen, there's no Titanic wreckage in that area. And again, 200 plus meters from the bow, and consistent with the location of last communication for an implosion in the water column. And the size of the debris field is consistent with that implosion in the water column.
So, Gadi, I asked the representatives today, I said, is there any chance that this mini-sub crashed into the wreckage of the Titanic? Or did it implode in the water above the Titanic? And he said, we believe it imploded in the water column above the Titanic. I don't know how far up, but then it rained the debris down some distance away from the Titanic. But listen, the horror here is not lost on anybody, that 100 years after Titanic killed so many people, 5 more lives have been lost right there at the Titanic.
Tom, after something like this normally happens, we see some sort of regulatory agency come in and do some sort of investigation. What happens in this case?
In this case, they're going to have to come up with an international body that makes a decision. First of all, as I mentioned, how to go forward with an investigation, and then what about recovery. Separate from that, there is this discussion about, this is, as I mentioned, a graveyard, and it's supposed to be, that area is supposed to be kind of off limits, and that's regulated, quote unquote regulated, or at least overseen by the Americans, by the British, by the Canadians, by the French. And so now, are they going to try to limit these tourist operations that come in on these mini subs? This is not the first, of course, mini sub to come down there and take a view of the Titanic. This is still a graveyard. Do they need to try to regulate that? Do they want to tell these various subs that they can't come that close? A lot of open questions here. I talked to one person today who said, we do let people walk through Normandy and the graveyard there, but you're respectful. Is this similar? How do you treat the great Titanic wreck site? And then now we've got the Titan wreck site very close by.
Tom, I've been watching your reporting all day long, and one thing that you said earlier in the day, and I was hoping that you could elaborate. I know you spoke to, or we've heard from the family, the Dawood family, the family of Suleiman. I believe it was an aunt of one of the victims. Yeah. What did she say about Suleiman's mindset when he went into this expedition?
So he's only 19 years old. He's a kid who goes to university in Scotland. His dad is Pakistani and British. They're very well off. They're among the wealthiest families in Pakistan. And his aunt says he really didn't want to go on this trip. He was scared. He was very nervous about it. But he went because his dad was excited, and his dad thought it would be, and he thought it would be a good bonding opportunity with his dad. And now, tragically, they've all lost their lives, including this 19-year-old. And by the way, the father is described by everybody we've talked to, yes, very wealthy, but very kind, very considerate, very giving, very thoughtful. To a person, everybody has described him in the same way, and as a role model for people. In fact, every one of them has described in some way that way. So despite the fact that they're very, very wealthy, most of them anyway, they're also very approachable.
Tom Costello, thanks so much. Again, as you can imagine, piecing together exactly what happened in a place so inhospitable to humans is extremely difficult, especially considering that so far we've only been able to send robots down there to search. But earlier today, the U.S. Coast Guard held a briefing to provide as much information as they could. Tom Costello was there, so we want to share an important part of all of that now. Take a quick listen.
This morning, an ROV, or remote-operated vehicle, from the vessel Horizon Arctic discovered the tail cone of the Titan submersible approximately 1,600 feet from the bow of the Titanic on the seafloor. The ROV subsequently found additional debris. In consultation with experts from within the Unified Command, the debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. Upon this determination, we immediately notified the families.
Essentially, we found 5 different major pieces of of debris that told us that it was the remains of the Titan. The initial thing we found was the nose cone, which was outside of the pressure hull. We then found a large debris field. Within that large debris field, we found the front end bell of the pressure hull.
What are the prospects for recovering crew members? And so this is a incredibly unforgiving environment down there on the seafloor. And the debris is consistent with a catastrophic implosion of the vessel. And so we'll continue to work and continue to search the area down there, but I don't have an answer for prospects at this time.
Joining us now is John Nathaniel Pascoe. He is the stepson of Paul-Henri Nargeolet, one of the 5 men who boarded the Titan for its final journey. John, thanks so much for joining us at such a hard time. Gotta ask, how are you guys doing right now?
It's a lot to handle right now. Obviously, as you can probably imagine, we've been living a nightmare this week. And I think, that goes for all the families involved in this. We can speak about PH, but it's been truly just a nightmare of an experience that I hope no one ever has to go through again. But we're sticking together as a family and getting through it all one moment at a time.
These last few days, I can't even imagine. Were you being provided updates on what was going on with the search and rescue?
I'll speak for myself. I was informed directly with the Coast Guard starting on Wednesday. So I was speaking with them with other families, and we were given information that way. Earlier than that, I had just been talking with PH's daughter and his wife, getting updates that way. So I was informed throughout the week. I originally found out about it early Monday morning. But yes, I was informed, especially in the final days.
Did your family get to talk to PH before he embarked?
Yes, I believe some of his kids did. I'm not 100% sure, but I know obviously, with Sunday being Father's Day, I'm sure he got a few messages from his kids. I had spoken with him a few weeks before as well. I was actually planning on seeing him just after the 4th of July. We had scheduled some time to get together. And I had seen him in May as well when he had mentioned that he was going on this trip. And of course, knowing him and how many times he's been down there, I honestly thought nothing of it, other than it's another exciting trip for PH down at the Titanic, something he's done so many times and has been so successful with. So yeah, that's kind of the extent of the communication we've had with him.
Yeah, he seems to be such an icon to the diving community. Can you tell me a little bit more about PH?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because there's so many, places online you can read about the number of dives he's done, the places he's been, and that's tremendous, right? But there's so much more to him as a person that I wanted to talk about. And he was a really incredible stepfather to me. I know sometimes with stepfathers, things can be a little bit tense in the family. My father was still in the picture, but he was so respectful and more. And of course, as a son, I always wanted, my mother to be protected, right? That, she was okay and loved. He did so much of that. And there's so many instances that, I was just blown away by his love and care for me, as a stepson. We first met in high school high school for me, which is about 2006. And, we just hit it off really well. And he was so kind to me, an incredible sense of humor too. I think, I want people to he's a prankster too. He has so many great stories about pranks he would play. And, whether it was, in his older days or when he was with the French Navy, it was so funny. And we spent so many nights together at the dinner table with my mom, and him just hearing about the stories he had. And, those are just incredible moments that I now look back on and really cherish.
Fearless and good-humored. I mean, what more can you ask for? As you think of him, what is his legacy to you?
Oh, boy. I think it's kind of what you said in terms of being fearless, right? I mean, there's so much of the discussion now is about risk, and the risks that everyone took going on board and the risks that, everyone has just, in terms of getting in a submersible period, right? There's so much risk in this world, in my opinion. And I think, going into this, he knew, the risks that were possible with this expedition. But again, he was fearless and, just so loving. And it's not only just his family. I saw the way he interacted with, coworkers as well, and other friends in the community. He was just such a well-respected guy that handled everything, so professionally, whether it was, Titanic related, expedition related, or it was just everyday life. I'm just so impressed by, the big heart, he has, and sense of humor he brought. And it's just a truly devastating day to hear this news.
And how would you describe his love of the ocean?
I mean, in my opinion, it was his home away from home. He was just so comfortable out there, and in any ocean, any lake, wherever it was, the water was just so connected to him, and that especially goes for the Titanic. He put so much of his life into that ship, and I think it showed that he's, in my opinion, the world expert on the Titanic. And he talked about it pretty frequently with us. Of course, we talked about other things, life in general, and all that stuff that you would with a stepfather. But he was so passionate about it, and there were so many curiosities he had and places he wanted to explore and shipwrecks he wanted to dive on. It was so cool. It's funny, he talked about it so much, I almost became numb to it in a way because of how much he talked about it and how cool it was. It's just, another amazing, expedition you get to go on. That's so cool. And, but yeah, he's just such an inspiration in terms of the amount of work he put in and his fearlessness with everything.
And finally, it's still too soon to know exactly what happened down there. But I want to ask, given everything that we've started to see with OceanGate and its history, what are the questions that you have for that company or the family has for that company going forward?
I think for me, just understanding, were all the safety procedures followed as closely as possible. Was everyone aware of everything that was going on? Was there anything that was missed during any kind of inspection? But, at the same time, anyone who gets into those submersibles knows the risks that could happen. Nothing's perfect, nothing's impenetrable. There's risk anytime you get into a submersible. So I understand that, and I think his entire family does as well. But I think those are the things that, come to the top of mind, and, we'll hopefully get those answers at some point.
John, thank you so much for your time. Our condolences to your entire family. We're praying for you guys. Thank you.
Hey, I really appreciate it.
Now, as more information comes out about this catastrophe, so many people are naturally asking why even go down there in the first place? And that's something our next guest has a lot of experience with. His name is Dr. Michael Guillen. He is the former news science editor for ABC News. He was actually the first person to report from the wreck of the Titanic back in 2000, that 2.5 miles below the surface. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us. You had a pretty terrifying accident during that voyage. In fact, Doctor, if we can, let's just play a quick clip from that report.
As we approach the stern of the ship, we're suddenly caught up in a strong underwater current that pushes us towards one of the gigantic 21-ton propellers.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh, look at the size of that thing. Look at the blade, it's still clean, like it's brand new.
But when we try to back out...
I felt a little bit of a boom, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, look at these things.
Oh my God, look at the size of these things.
Oh my gosh, so are we stuck or what?
As this graphic shows, we appear to be somehow wedged beneath the wreck of the stern.
Dr. Guillen, I mean, I can't even fathom what must have been going through your mind in that moment.
You know, Gadi, I've had to relive it all this week, and it's agonizing for me because I feel such a kinship to the people who lost their lives. And it's interesting in listening to PH's stepson, who so eloquently spoke about him and his love of the ocean. I was just the opposite. When I received the invitation to be the first TV correspondent to report from the Titanic, my inclination was to decline because I have a deathly fear of water. I don't even know how to swim. And so I thought, of all the things, I don't want to do that. But then, of course, it's my job. So I went down there and everything went smoothly. I mean, the dive took us about 2.5 hours down. We went to the hull of the bow of the ship. We had a moment of prayer. But as you saw on that videotape, we got caught between the poop deck, the inverted poop deck, and the blades of this giant propeller. The propeller's much bigger than our sub. And, you know, it's like when you're driving on a beautiful sunny day and you think you're on top of the world, you're admiring the scenery, and then, boom, all of a sudden somebody just T-bones you. That was my initial reaction. It's like, what just happened? Wait a minute. And once that was clarified, I understood that we were in a life-threatening situation. But as a scientist, I immediately started wondering, well, there has to be a way out of this thing, right? But very quickly I realized there wasn't. And hitting that brick wall made me feel enormously sad, as if the entire weight of the Atlantic Ocean above me, 2.5 miles of water, just kind of descended on my shoulders. I'll never forget that. It was terrifying.
I can imagine. You know, I got to say, I'm not sure if other people at home watching this might be struck by this, but when we see the footage from back in 2000, we see this sub that you got in, and then we see the sub that just went down. Again, we're talking a 20-year difference. You'd think that maybe 20 years would give us something that looks a little bit more technologically advanced, but did you feel safe in the sub that you were in? And would you have gone down if your younger self was offered a chance to go down with the vessel that we just saw go down, Titan?
It's a great question, and it's an important question, so I'm going to answer it very carefully. The vessel I was in was a Russian vessel. They're still in operation. And those vessels, there's Mir 1, Mir 2, Russian, Mir is the Russian word for peace. These were originally designed for scientific research. They're still being used for scientific research. So they were very serious vessels created by very serious-minded people for a very serious purpose. And imagine this, Gadi, that the vessel that I was in survived the impact. That shows you how strong these things are. These have been up and down hundreds of times. As I say, they're still in operation. The French have similar deep submersibles. By contrast, Titan was designed from the get-go for tourism. It's a big difference. And I think some of the questions you were asking PH's stepson are very, very appropriate. Was everything done to make certain that that vessel was seaworthy? So it's not as if we haven't advanced in our technology in 23 years since I was there. It's just that this particular company decided that they wanted to use as many off-the-shelf parts as possible. I don't know if the CEO, I'm not familiar with the company. It's the first time I heard about him, but I've heard a few things from the CEO that concerned me. Apparently part of his mission was to show that he wanted to use these kind of off-the-shelf parts. He talked about getting something from Camper's World, using a game controller. These are things that are very different than the situation I was in. This is a scientific research vessel piloted by a very experienced former Russian MiG pilot, and the captain of the ship, the Akademik Keldysh that we were on, was a very serious-minded man. So it's a very different thing, Gadi, and it's going to be very interesting in the days and weeks ahead when these very tough questions that need to be asked, and we demand honest answers, we'll see what falls out from all of this.
And Dr. Guillen, your report will go down in history, and I got to say, when that happens in your report, you realize that the captain that you're talking about, the pilot of that sub, hands down saved your life. You have 2.5 miles of water above you. I hate to ask, but you're familiar with pressurization at that level. Do you think what happened here was painless?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, look, Gadi, I'm going to be honest with you. When I first started, when I was being interviewed by reporters all over the world and they were asking me what happened, this was, at the beginning of the week, I looked at the evidence. I'm a scientist. I look at evidence and I formulate a hypothesis. And it was very clear to me from the get-go that this was a catastrophic failure of the entire vessel. I even used that word. It's interesting that the Rear Admiral used that word today in his press conference. I was saying that all week. Why? Can't get into all the reasons why. We probably don't have time. But it was clear to me that this was not just a communications failure, because this vessel was designed so that the ballast would automatically jettison after 24 hours, whether the mission was successful or not. That didn't happen. It also had a backup, electrical backup. That didn't happen. And that it had yet another backup where you could manually jettison the ballast so that this thing could rise to the top safely by pneumatics with compressed air. That didn't happen. So it was obvious to me that this was a catastrophe that involved not just communications, but the entire vessel. And this is what happened. It was down, it happened about an hour, 43 minutes in. So it didn't even make it to the bottom. It takes typically 2 to 3 hours to get to the bottom. So what clearly happened here, it's about as clear as it can get, is that 1 hour, 40-some minutes into, while it's still in the water, about 2/3 of the way down, it developed some kind of a structural failure on the pressure vessel. It could have been a microfracture that it acquired in the previous 2 journeys that it had gone down. Like the expression, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Well, in this case, this pressure vessel is only the strongest as its weakest point. And it only takes a microscopic weakness that you can only see with X-rays. And the ocean at that point, even at that depth, even though they hadn't reached the bottom, is pressing on you. Imagine the pressure pressing on you in all directions. Boom, and it collapsed. And so quickly, I mean, so quickly, those poor souls didn't even know what happened to them. So I consider that merciful, because all of us were worried, oh my God, this is a slow death. I was down there for between a half hour and an hour, and it seemed like an eternity. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, these poor people are suffering for days. But mercifully, it was quick, Gadi. I can tell you, quick and painless. They didn't even know what hit them.
Dr. Guillen, with the perspective that so few humans on planet Earth have, thank you so very much for your time and your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you, Gadi.
And as we move into the recovery phase of that wreckage and the investigation into what went wrong on board that small sub known as the Titan, one critical part of all this is the timeline. And here's what we have so far. On Saturday, British billionaire and explorer Hamish Harding posts on Instagram he will be among those to voyage down to the Titanic with OceanGate. He says due to bad winter, this would likely be the first and only manned mission to the Titanic in 2023. And on Sunday at 8 a.m., the Titan launches off the Canadian research vessel called the Polar Prince and begins to descend, presumably pinging the ship above with text messages on its way down. Then around 9:43, 9:45, communication is lost. Fast forward to Monday, U.S. and Canadian ships and planes arrive. Specialized sonar buoys are dropped in the water, and sonar specialists begin to monitor any sounds 24 hours a day. The Coast Guard says the sub would have had oxygen supply of about 96 hours when it first started. Then Tuesday, authorities report that unknown underwater noises had been detected, and the search area is widened. Thursday, 6 a.m., that's the deadline when the oxygen was expected to run out. 1 p.m., the U.S. Coast Guard reports debris has been found. They had discovered it with an ROV near the Titanic wreck, and OceanGate puts out a statement saying they believe those inside have sadly been lost. Now, at some point in that timeline between the loss of the communication and the second day, we know that the Navy analyzed acoustic data and detected a sound consistent with an implosion or an explosion in that area and shared that information with searchers. Again, we still don't know exactly when. With us now is retired Navy Captain David Marquet. Captain, so I know that you were very familiar with the salvage and recovery, everything from, Blackhawks that have gone down to fighter jets that have gone down. I can't imagine what it must be to bring up every piece of that sub that's 2.5 miles down. What happens first? Is it documentation?
Well, I think we do need to assemble the pieces as much as possible if we want to investigate what specifically happened to the vessel. I think the previous guest described it quite vividly and, in my mind, quite accurately. As your vessel is going deeper, the ocean is pressing on all sides, and even if the tiniest flaw, it could be a minute crack. In this particular vessel, we had a carbon fiber cylinder, and we had 2 titanium end heads, and then a viewing window bolted together. In addition, there are going to be penetrations where wires are going to go through so they can be inside, but controlling thrusters and things outside. All of those penetrations are vulnerabilities. If the bolts aren't torqued right, if somehow the vendor substituted a lower metallic bolt for a higher level metallic bolt, if there are cracks, because what's happening is there's compression, relaxation, and these are tremendous stresses on the vessel. We know from our submarines that the metal forms these little tiny cracks, so we inspect for those. So anything like that, and there was nothing they could have done. They are totally helpless about the situation, and the ocean collapses just as he said.
And just looking at the subs that you have behind you here, I know that our nuclear-class submarines don't go that deep. We just saw a piece with a Mir 1, that Russian sub that did go down there back in the 2000s. And we know that there are other manned subs that can go down there. But is this entire mission that we're about to see going to be done solely with remotely operated subs?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure the value of sending people down there. There's sort of this voyeuristic sense of, well, I'm looking through some window and seeing the Titanic. Personally, I wouldn't take that risk. To me, the gain, you would take risk commensurate with gain. And so for me, I don't really sense the gain there. I do think we can build vessels that allow humans to go to that depth. But we have a long history. We're at sea for 30, 60, 90 days. I spent 87 days at one point underwater the entire time. And you learn things about how to operate the ship. You learn a certain chronic sense of unease, a chronic sense of humility about what nature can do to you, what the corrosive environment of the sea can do to you. And so we're always checking all these things. And we always say, like, if you're sleeping well, you're missing something. You're too comfortable.
Talking a little bit about the pressurization here, what happens in an implosion of this magnitude? I know that they found pieces in different places. I'd imagine that it would all just crumple together. Does it expand out at some point, or why is it not just all in one place?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it kind of depends where the crack is and that kind of thing. But let's say that the viewing window. There were some reports that said the viewing window wasn't rated for the full depth. Well, let's say the viewing window developed a tiny crack. What happens is, bang, the ocean rushes in, and the shock wave, in my mind, I'm guessing, would then blow the rest of it out. So that's why you can see this debris field around. And this is why also there's no bodies to recover, because they're immediately disintegrated because of this tremendous shock wave.
Yeah, some small solace in knowing that whatever happened instantly.
Absolutely.
Captain David Marquet, thank you so much for joining us. And it was clear from the start that this was a dangerous journey. Those who signed up for it or paid as much as $250,000 for it signed a waiver before going to the depths of the ocean. But we've been hearing there have been more concerns over red flags that may have been raised before this tragedy happened. So who is liable for that? Let's bring in our legal analyst, Danny Savalas. Danny, those waivers, are passengers actually signing their lives away here? Or is there a possibility of liability?
Yes, they're signing their lives away, just like you probably signed your life away 3 or 4 times this week on some waiver that you probably clicked through on your iPhone, and so did everybody else. Yes, waivers are generally enforceable, although I have, and many attorneys have successfully overcome releases if they're oppressively written or they're deceptive. Generally speaking, the default rule is if you sign a release, it's probably going to be enforceable against you with some exceptions. The other thing folks aren't really talking about is how difficult it is to bring a case against the owner of a vessel or something else on the high seas. Both Canada and the United States have long had, for centuries, very protective laws against or really frustrating the ability of attorneys like me, and I've tried to bring these cases against shipping or vessels or anything nautical, anything in the admiralty realm. And generally speaking, there's a very strict limitation on liability that actually is based on the tonnage of the vessel. And this submersible did not have a lot of tonnage. It certainly wasn't an aircraft carrier or a cargo ship.
How does jurisdiction in a case like this work? These are international waters, right?
Yeah, generally speaking, it's usually the jurisdiction goes by either the flag that's being flown on the vessel itself. It can also depend on what nation it's closest to. But believe me, there is always a lot of litigation because any plaintiff wants to get into the best jurisdiction. And one of the better jurisdictions is usually the United States for any kind of injury or wrongful death case. But Canada has a similar national law that limits liability against the shipping industry for injuries like this. And since this was the closest to the country of Canada, and since I believe the vessel that brought it along, not the actual submersible, but the vessel that was overhead and brought the submersible out, I believe that was flying also a Canadian flag as well. So in all likelihood, if there is any jurisdiction, it goes to Canada, and then any plaintiffs would have to fight that limitation of liability law that Canada has, just like the U.S.
Danny, we've been seeing some reporting that former passengers, possibly even a former employee, were raising safety concerns with the Titan. What role would that have in any sort of suit?
It would have a massive role because that is the key to a negligence case, whether you're talking about a motor vehicle accident or any kind of negligence. I mean, if you're talking about slipping in a grocery store on a grape, the key is notice, because if a defendant knew in advance that there was a problem, that means that they were aware of the problem and didn't do anything to fix it. The hardest case to win is something that nobody ever foresaw could possibly happen. A bolt of lightning, getting hit by a meteor. These are not things that you can anticipate or prepare for. But if there are reports, prior accidents, prior reports, prior complaints that suggest that a defendant had notice of a dangerous situation and failed to do anything to fix it, that is the key to getting a proper negligence case against any defendant, nautical, non-nautical, anywhere.
Danny Savalas, thanks so much. Now, real quick, before we go to break, in the wake of all this, there's something that James Cameron said that really caught our attention. Now, remember, he's the director and documentarian who you could argue has contributed the most to the lore of the Titanic and these images that we all have in our collective minds. Now, in an interview with ABC, he invoked the memory of the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, and said he was struck by the similarities of what happened to the Titan and the Titanic disaster, where the captain was repeatedly warned about ice ahead of his ship and yet steamed at full speed into the ice field. For now, the Titan is resting on the bottom of the sea floor next to the Titanic and a watery grave of more than 1,500 other souls that lost their lives over a century ago. For some reason, we humans keep going back to that place when the vast majority of the 1.3 billion feet of ocean remain 95% unexplored. I don't know, just a bit of perspective as we look towards what's still to come. I hope you stay with us. Much more news to cover right after the break. Hey there, welcome back. And here are some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. We finally found out who posted bail for Congressman George Santos. It was his father and his aunt who dished out $500,000 to keep him out of jail. Santos pled guilty to not guilty to 13 federal charges, including fraud and theft. And today, the Supreme Court ruled against the Navajo Nation in a water supply case. In a 5-4 vote, the justices found that an 1868 treaty did not require the federal government to secure water access for the tribe. And remember that train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, back in February? Well, today we found out the town's fire chief only had 13 minutes to decide to vent and burn those toxic chemicals. He said there was a consensus that it was the least bad option. And this video just in shows a group of neo-Nazis interrupting a drag story hour at an LGBTQ-owned coffee shop in New Hampshire. In it, you can see more than a dozen men wearing matching outfits and chanting homophobic slurs and banging on the shop's windows. And in Colorado, almost 100 people were hurt at a concert last night. A powerful hailstorm at the Red Rocks Park Amphitheater produced golf ball-sized hail At least 7 people were taken to hospitals. And tonight, another Texas community is picking up the pieces after a deadly tornado barreled through last night. This absolutely massive funnel cloud touched down in the small town of Matador. At least 4 people have died and 10 others were hurt. And in a town of about 600 people, virtually every member of the community has been impacted.
A town of this size, with such a small population, with the amount of damage that they experience, it's not only physical damage, but the economical and emotional impact that it will have on this town is very well significant.
Now, emergency responders say everyone there has been accounted for, but search efforts are still underway in case anyone passing through is hurt. NBC News correspondent Priscilla Thompson has more on the recovery and the widespread power outages during a heat wave.
Yeah, that tiny town of Matador dealing with an immense amount of devastation today after a tornado ripped through there late yesterday. We know that earlier today, Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued a disaster declaration, and that is going to allow for those state resources to go in there, including search and rescue teams that have been working throughout the day to ensure that that death toll does not continue to rise or will not continue to rise. Right now, it sits at 4 people who have been killed and 9 people who have been injured. And in addition to those rescue efforts, those folks are also grappling with all of that damage and devastation. We are talking about 20 homes and businesses that have been destroyed. And so they are working to clean up and clear out those debris. And of course, the other big concern in a situation like this is electricity and power. Right now, the majority of the people in that town are without power, and that is as Texas is seeing incredibly high, record-breaking temperatures. And so a really big concern is getting that power restored. We know that a cooling center has opened there, and so that is going to be able to provide some relief, but certainly a big concern in the days ahead as those cleanup efforts continue. And this is the third small town in just a week to see this type of devastation. There was a tornado that ripped through Mississippi earlier this week where 1 person died, and of course Perryton, Texas last week, which saw 3 people killed after a tornado ripped through there. And so the South really being battered by this severe weather, these thunderstorms, hail, heavy rain, and also these incredibly devastating tornadoes. And at the same time, other parts of Texas, New Mexico, even parts of Oklahoma seeing just incredibly high temperatures. In fact, yesterday there were 6 heat records that were broken across Texas. And so that is a look at what the South is grappling with now as it just continues to be battered by this incredibly severe weather. So quite a way to start the summer here in Texas. Gadi?
NBC's Priscilla Thompson, thanks so much. And tonight in Wyoming, a judge just blocked a statewide medication abortion ban. And we're not talking about the broader FDA lawsuit challenging the approval of that drug, but rather a law that actually passed a few months ago in that state. It is the first of its kind in the United States, specifically banning medication abortion across the state. And it was supposed to take effect July 1st. But tonight, a judge ruled that abortion pills can remain legal while a lawsuit plays out. One of the plaintiffs in that suit is a brand new abortion clinic in Casper, Wyoming, but legal battles are far from the only challenge they've faced. Here's NBC's Zincle Esamoah with more.
Someone broke into the clinic and proceeded to set some of the exam rooms on fire.
An arrest has not yet been made. In 2022, Wellspring Health Access in Casper, Wyoming was burned down. Today, after nearly $300,000 in repairs, doctors are finally starting to see patients, making this the only clinic in the state to offer both surgical and medical abortions, according to Wyoming providers.
I did not feel fearful coming to Casper or to the clinic until after the arson.
Julie Burkhardt is the founder and president of Wellspring in the nearly 60,000-person town of Casper. Though the state's abortion policies remain in legal limbo, the clinic remains open.
We have to fly physicians in from other states.
Burkhardt adds that patients now come from surrounding states as well, but it's not without resistance.
I never like to see babies killed intentionally.
Weekly protesters like John, who declined to provide his last name, opposing the clinic. Also outspoken is Casper's mayor, Bruce Nell.
They're welcome to do business here in our community, but as a human being, I have reservations.
When Wellspring reopened in April, Nell posted this image on the Facebook page of a local news outlet, some interpreting it as support of the arson attack, which he denies.
In poor taste, I made a comment that I feel was misinterpreted.
What was that to you?
To me, it was not a picture of a burning building. It was of a person dancing in the fire. And my reference to that was those that choose to take the life of the unborn are certainly going to find the depths of hell.
Do you believe that was an appropriate thing to post as mayor?
As mayor or as Bruce Nell?
As Mayor Bruce Nell.
I don't know that it was inappropriate. I think it was in poor taste.
Prior to Wellspring Health Access, there were only two options for abortion in Wyoming, justthepill.org and Dr. Jovanina Anthony, who's been practicing in Jackson, Wyoming since 2005.
I just never thought that regular communication with attorneys would be part of my practice.
Anthony is one of the plaintiffs challenging Wyoming's total abortion ban. For now, with that ban contested in court, the Wellspring staff continue their work undeterred.
If we can only see patients for 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, at least we were able to see people and help those people in that moment in time.
Zincle Asamoah, NBC News.
Zincle, thank you for that. And the suspect in that arson attack, Lorna Roxanne Green, has pled not guilty to a felony arson charge. The 22-year-old college student told investigators she opposes abortion and was experiencing nightmares and anxiety about the clinic when she decided to burn it. She now faces up to 20 years in prison if convicted. And coming up, some of the headlines trending around the world. Russia is saying journalist Evan Gershkovich must stay in jail until August. We're going to have all those details when we come back. Now, as the world watches what's been happening near the Titanic, there's been another heartbreaking story at sea unfolding in an area known as the most dangerous migrant crossing in the world. At least 80 people are confirmed dead. Hundreds of migrants are missing after their boat sank 50 miles off the coast of Greece. NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley has more on the tragedy in the Mediterranean.
So you could call it a tale of two maritime tragedies, the one we've been hearing about nonstop for days, in which rescuers are now almost certain that all 5 members of that submersible in the North Atlantic have died. And then there was that other one with the hundreds of migrants who likely died last week when their rickety boat sank off the coast of Greece. Many of them were probably children. Now, clearly, these two tragedies were treated very differently, both by the global media and by rescue workers. But why? On social media and beyond, some have said that race, politics, and economic status were major factors. The 5 men whose deaths were announced today were almost all millionaires and billionaires. And the migrants who perished off the Greek coast were effectively refugees, among the poorest and most desperate people on the planet. It's a troubling juxtaposition and one that does give cause for thought. But it's hardly an apples-to-apples comparison. As far as the media is concerned, well, it's easy to see why a bunch of wealthy people trapped in a makeshift submarine while visiting the Titanic might make for a gripping story. For many critics, it's the emergency response that illustrates a kind of favoritism. But that's also not so straightforward. More than 100 people were rescued from the Greek tragedy, thought to be one of the deadliest on the Mediterranean in recent memory. And unlike with the submarine, the migrant victims whose bodies weren't long ago presumed dead. After all, they weren't in a sealed submarine. But it's up to you to decide for yourself whether reporters and rescuers acted with professionalism or prejudice.
Matt Bradley with an incredibly important reminder. Matt Bradley, thank you very much. Before we go, a battle of the billionaires, Musk versus Zuckerberg. And we're not talking about a tech battle. This is more like a knock each other out, try to punch each other in the face, kind of meet you behind the gym after 6 period brawl. Except this one would be in Vegas, probably at the Octagon. It's a weird world. We're going to explain when we come back, so stay tuned. And tonight in The Future of Everything, this story has the entire tech world talking. And no, it's not some exciting new technological breakthrough. Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg have been in a viral back and forth about an actual cage match in real life. And this whole thing started when Musk commented on a tweet about Meta reportedly working on a project with a Twitter rival. Musk wrote that the world was becoming exclusively under Zuck's thumb with no other options. And that prompted one Twitter user to comment, that's because of Zuckerberg's jiu-jitsu training, which, yeah, he's actually been doing, and he's kind of getting good at it. Musk then wrote, I'm up for a cage fight if he is, LOL, which Zuckerberg responded. And again, he is the CEO of Facebook and Instagram. He responded, send me a location. And if you think that back and forth stopped there, it did not. Musk proposed the Vegas Octagon as the location for this battle royale, but jokingly pointed out that he lacks some fighting skills. He wrote, I have this great move that I call the walrus, where I just lie on top of my opponent and do nothing. But joke or not, the possibility of a fight seems to be lighting up on social media. Bets are already being placed for who would come out on top. As of earlier tonight, DraftKings projected odds at 140 plus for Musk and negative 160 for Zuckerberg. I don't know. Zuckerberg's looking kind of jacked these days. Weird stuff. Finally tonight, a blast from the past. Remember Friday nights at your local video store? Well, they're back. We got to visit a legit movie institution in Los Angeles that's bringing back the glory days of VHS. Take a look.
Remember what it was like getting ready for a Friday night, heading to your local video store to peruse the aisles?
Now this is a video store.
Well, that experience is nearly forgotten these days. But in the shell of a 94-year-old movie theater in Northeast LA's Eagle Rock neighborhood, a merry band of hopeless optimists are mounting an unlikely comeback.
It was the thing to do. Friday nights were like a party in our store.
Kathy Tauber and Patty Polinger opened Vidiot's in 1985, and for more than 30 years, the independent video shop was an LA institution. Until 2017, when the forces reshaping the media landscape caught up.
We were trying to reinvent ourselves, trying to stay vital, and it was like, in the end, we just couldn't pull any more rabbits out of the hat.
Like tens of thousands of communities across the country, what was once a fixture faded. Until now.
There's nothing like walking down here.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, this is like being 15.
With the help of a star-studded cast of supporters like the morning show's Mark Duplass, Vidiot's is celebrating the unimaginable. The grand opening of a new video store with an astonishing 60,000 titles for rent, a 270-seat movie theater, and a hunger for the shared experiences of the past.
You can come to a place like this and say, God, you know, I really love what Spike Lee was doing and what Hal Hartley was doing. But, like, I also kind of like stuff that's, like, a little more, like, visually interesting, you know? It's like, come with me. Come with me, my child, you know? And they hook you up.
Do you think that's something an algorithm can do?
I don't know, but my honest answer to that is I don't want it. I want to be with a person. I want to be able to look them in the eye. I want to have that experience.
And for kids who have grown up without all this,
that's where I think the mind-blowing is going to happen. They have no understanding of anything. Searching for films only happens here.
I have a feeling young kids are going to be like, is it a bookstore? Is this a bookstore? Wow. Why do you open it?
Yeah.
What is this thing inside
do
it?
I eat it? Is that what I do?
And so far, demand has been a bit like 1985, with more than 1,000 DVDs rented in just the first few days.
This is one of these things where the community just screamed, we want this thing and we need this thing. And that's the only reason it exists.
Did you ever imagine that you would be the last bastion standing in this entire landscape?
Never. We thought it was like a 5-year thing.
Call it a Hollywood comeback, hoping to recapture that Friday night magic.
That brings back so many feels of growing up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I remember the Blockbuster down the road, exactly where the Princess Bride was. I'm so excited that now there's a store that I get to take my daughter to and we can pull it off the shelf. Does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you tomorrow, but until then, stay tuned.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.